Chapter 19. Impasse. After a couple of strong whiskies, Bernard began to lose some of the shaken look with which he had returned to Kyle Manor. When he had given us an account of the Chief Constable's disastrous interview at the Grange, he went on, "You know, one of the few childlike things about the children, it strikes me, is their inability to judge their own strength. Except, perhaps, for the corralling of the village, everything they have done has been overdone. What might be excusable in intent, they contrived to make unforgivable in practice. They wanted to scare Sir John in order to convince him that it would be unwise to interfere with them. But they did not do simply what was necessary for that. They went so much farther that they brought the poor man to a state of grovelling fear near the brink of imbecility. They induced a degree of personal degradation that was sickening and utterly unpardonable." Zellaby asked in his mild, reasonable tone, "Are we not perhaps looking at this from too narrow an angle? You, Colonel, say unpardonable, which assumes that they expect to be pardoned. But why should they? Do we concern ourselves whether jackals or wolves will pardon us for shooting them? We do not. We are concerned only to make them innocuous. In point of fact, our ascendancy has been so complete that we are rarely called upon to kill wolves nowadays. In fact, most of us have quite forgotten what it means to have a fight in a personal way against another species. But when the need arises, we have no compunction in fully supporting those who slay the threat, whether it is from wolves, insects, bacteria, or filterable viruses. We give no quarter, and certainly expect no pardon. The situation vis-à-vis the children would seem to be that we have not grasped that they represent a danger to our species, while they are in no doubt that we are a danger to theirs, and they intend to survive. We might do well to remind ourselves what that intention implies. We can watch it any day in a garden. It is a fight that goes on perpetually, bitterly, lawlessly, without trace of mercy or compassion." His manner was quiet, but there was no doubt that his intention was pointed. And yet somehow, as so often with Zellaby, the gap between theory and practical circumstances seemed too inadequately bridged to carry conviction. Presently Bernard said, "Surely this is quite a change of front by the children. They've exerted persuasion and pressure from time to time, but apart from a few early incidents, almost no violence. Now we have this outbreak. Can you point to the start of it, or has it been working up?" "Decidedly," said Zellaby. "There was no sign whatever of anything in this category before the matter of Jimmy Paul and his car." "And that was, let me see, last Wednesday, the 3rd of July. I wonder—" He was beginning, but broke off as the gong called us to luncheon. "My experience hitherto of interplanetary invasion," said Zellaby as he concocted his own particular taste in salad dressing, "has been vicarious. Indeed, one might even say hypothetically vicarious. Or do I mean vicariously hypothetical?" He pondered that for a moment and resumed, "At any rate, it has been quite extensive. Yet, oddly enough, I cannot recall a single account of one that is of the least help in our present dilemma. They were, almost without exception, unpleasant, but also they were almost always forthright, rather than insidious. Take H.G. Wells' Martians, for instance. As the original exponents of the death ray, they were formidable, but their behaviour was quite conventional. They simply conducted a straightforward campaign with this weapon which outclassed anything that could be brought against it, but at least we could try to fight back. Whereas, in this case—" "Not Cayenne, dear," said his wife. "Not what?" "Not Cayenne. Hiccups," Angela reminded him. "Oh, so it does. Where's the sugar?" "By your left hand, dear." "Oh, yes. Where was I?" "With H.G.'s Martians," I told him. "Of course. Well, there you have the prototype of innumerable invasions, a superweapon which man fights valiantly with his own puny armory until he is saved by one of several possible kinds of bell.
Naturally, in America it is all rather bigger and better. Something descends and something comes out of it. Within 10 minutes, owing no doubt to the excellent communications in that country, there is a coast-to-coast panic, and all highways out of all cities are crammed in all lanes by fleeing populace. Except in Washington. There, by contrast, enormous crowds, stretching as far as the eye can reach, stand grave and silent, white-faced but trusting, with their eyes upon the White House, while somewhere in the Catskills a hitherto ignored professor and his daughter, with their rugged young assistant, strive like demented midwives to assist the birth of the Dea ex laboratoria, which will save the world at the last moment. -1. Over here, one feels the report of such an invasion would be received in at least some quarters with a tinge of preliminary skepticism, but we must allow the Americans to know their own people best. Yet overall, what do we have? Just another war. The motivations are simplified, the armaments complicated, but the pattern is the same. And as a result, not one of the prognostications, speculations, or extrapolations turns out to be of the least use to us when the thing actually happens. It really does seem a pity, when one thinks of all the cerebration the prognosticators have spent on it, doesn't it?
He busied himself with eating his salad. It is still one of my problems to know when you're to be taken literally and when metaphorically, I told him. This time you can take him literally, with assurance, Bernard put in. Zellaby cocked a sideways look at him.
Just like that? Not even reflex opposition? He inquired. Tell me, Colonel, how long have you accepted this invasion as a fact?
For about 8 years, Bernard told him. And you?
About the same time, perhaps a little before. I did not like it. I do not like it. I'm probably going to like it even less, but I had to accept it. The old Holmes axiom, you know. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I had not known, however, that that was recognized in official circles. What did you decide to do about it?
Well, we did our best to preserve their isolation here, and to see to their education.
And a fine, helpful thing that turns out to have been, if I may say so. Why?
Just a minute, I put in. I'm in between the literal and figurative again. You are both of you seriously accepting as a fact that these children are a kind of invaders? That they do originate somewhere outside the Earth?
See,
said Zellaby.
No coast-to-coast panic, just skepticism. I told you.
We are, Bernard told me. It is the only hypothesis that my department has not been forced to abandon, though, of course, there are some who still won't accept it, even though we had the help of a little more evidence than Mr. Zellaby did.
Ah, said Zellaby, brought to sudden attention, with a forkful of green stuff in mid-air. Are we getting closer to the mysterious MI interest in us?
There is no longer any reason now, I think, why it should not have a restricted circulation, Bernard admitted. I know that in the early stages you did quite a little inquiring, Zellaby, but I don't believe you ever discovered the clue.
Which was?
Inquired Zellaby. Simply that Midwich was not the only, nor even the first place to have a day out. Also that during the 3 weeks around that time there was a marked rise in the radar detection of unidentified flying objects.
Well, I'm damned, said Zellaby. Oh, vanity, vanity. There are other groups of children besides ours, then? Where?
But Bernard was not to be hurried. He continued deliberately. One day out took place at a small township in the Northern Territory of Australia. Something apparently went badly wrong there. There were 33 pregnancies, but for some reason the children all died. Most of them a few hours after birth. The oldest at a week old. There was another day out at an Eskimo settlement on Victoria Island, north of Canada. The inhabitants are cagey about what happened there, but it is believed that they were so outraged, or perhaps alarmed, at the arrival of babies so unlike their own kind, that they exposed them almost at once. At any rate, none survived. And that, by the way, taken in conjunction with the time of the Midwich baby's return here, suggests that the power of duress does not develop until they are a week or two old, and that they may be truly individuals until then. Still another day out. Zellaby held up his hand.
Let me guess. There was one behind the Iron Curtain.
There were 2 known ones behind the curtain, Bernard corrected him. One of them was in the Irkutsk region, near the border of Outer Mongolia. A very grim affair. It was assumed that the women had been lying with devils, and they perished as well as the children. The other was right away to the east, a place called Gizhinsk, in the mountains northeast of Okhotsk. There may have been others that we didn't hear of. It's pretty certain it happened in some places in South America and in Africa too, but it's difficult to check. The inhabitants tend to be secretive. It's even possible that an isolated village would miss a day and not know it. In which case the babies would be even more of a puzzle. In most of the instances we do know of, the babies were regarded as freaks and were killed. But we suspect that in some they may have been hidden away.
But not, I take it, in Gizhinsk,
put in Zellaby. Bernard looked at him with a small twitch to the corner of his mouth. You don't miss much, do you, Zellaby? You're right, not in Gizhinsk. The day out there took place a week before the Midwich one. We had the report of it 3 or 4 days later. It worried the Russians quite a lot. That was at least some consolation to us when it happened here. We knew that they couldn't have been responsible. They, presumably, in due course found out about Midwich, and were also relieved. Meanwhile, our agent kept an eye on Gizhinsk, and in due course reported the curious fact that every woman there was simultaneously pregnant. We were a little slow in appreciating any significance in that. It sounded like useless, if peculiar, tittle-tattle, but presently we discovered the state of affairs in Midwich and began to take more interest. Once the babies were born, the situation was easier for the Russians than for us. They practically sealed off Gizhinsk, a place about twice the size of Midwich, and our information from there virtually ceased. We could not exactly seal off Midwich, so we had to work differently, and in these circumstances I don't think we did too badly. Zellaby nodded.
I see. The War Office view being that it did not quite know what we had here, or what the Russians had there, but if it should turn out the Russians had a flock of potential geniuses, it would be useful for us to have a similar flock to put up against them.
More or less that. It was quite quickly clear that they were something unusual.
I ought to have seen that, said Zellaby.
He shook his head sadly.
It simply never crossed my mind that we in Midwich were not unique. It does, however, now cross my mind that something must have happened to cause you to admit it. I don't quite see why the events here should justify that. So it probably happened somewhere else, say in Gizhinsk. Has there been a new development there that our children are likely to display shortly?
Bernard put his knife and fork neatly together on his plate, regarded them for a moment, and then looked up. The Far East Army, he said slowly, has recently been equipped with a new medium-type atomic cannon, believed to have a range of between 50 and 60 miles. Last week they carried out the first live tests with it. The town of Gizhinsk no longer exists. We stared at him. With a horrified expression, Angela leant forward. "You mean everybody there?" she said incredulously. Bernard nodded. Everybody. The entire place. No one there could have been warned without the children getting to know of it. Besides, the way it was done, it could be officially attributed to an error in calculation, or possibly to sabotage. He paused again. Officially, he repeated, and for home and general consumption. We have, however, received a carefully channeled observation from Russian sources. It is rather guarded on details and particulars, but there is no doubt that it refers to Gizhinsk, and was probably released simultaneously with the action taken there. It doesn't refer directly to Midwich either, but what it does do is to put out a most forcefully expressed warning. After a description which fits the children exactly, It speaks of them as groups which present not just a national danger wherever they exist, but a racial danger of a most urgent kind. It calls upon all governments everywhere to neutralize any such known groups with the least possible delay. It does this most emphatically, with almost a note of panic at times. It insists, over and over again, even with a touch of pleading, that this should be done swiftly, not just for the sake of nations or of continents, but because these children are a threat to the whole human race. Zellaby went on tracing the damask pattern on the tablecloth for some time before he looked up. Then he said, "And MI's reaction to this? To wonder what fast one the Russians were trying to pull this time, I suppose?" And he returned to doodling on the damask. "Most of us, yes. Some of us, no," admitted Bernard. Presently Zellaby looked up again. "They dealt with Gzhinsk last week, you say? Which day?" "Tuesday, the 2nd of July," Bernard told him. Zellaby nodded several times slowly. "Interesting," he said. "But how, I wonder, did ours know?"
Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to hear more great stories.